When you're preparing for a really massive career-defining exam, it can sometimes feel like you're playing this ridiculously hard video game. Like, you clear the easy levels, you pick up some basic skills, but eventually, you have to face the final boss.
Right. The one that just crushes you if you aren't ready.
Exactly. And if you are studying for the UGC NET English exam, there is one boss that is notoriously complex, heavily armored, and just waiting to trip you up. And we are talking, of course, about T.S. Eliot.
Oh, yeah. That is honestly the perfect way to describe him. I mean, he is the ultimate test maker's dream because he isn't just one thing.
Yeah, he's a lot of things.
Right. To defeat this particular boss, you can't simply memorize a few lines of poetry. Examiners love him because testing Eliot means testing a student's grasp of an entire intellectual framework.
It's like a whole worldview.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to understand a pioneering poet, a brilliant essayist, a critic, and a verse dramatist all rolled into one. Like, if you think he's only important for his poems, you've already fallen into the first major trap.
Which is exactly why we're here today. So welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is simple. We are hacking the UGC NET English exam.
Let's do it.
We're taking a dense, heavy stack of exam-oriented study notes and transforming them into a fiercely logical breakdown of T.S. Eliot. We're going to explore how his mind worked, unpack his critical theories, and most importantly, reveal the specific traps examiners use to catch you off guard.
And they will try to catch you.
Oh, guaranteed. So whether you're cramming for this test right now or you're just intensely curious about why this single individual completely reshaped modern literature, we are giving you the ultimate cheat codes to his genius.
Yeah, and to really understand that genius, I mean, we have to look at the world that created him. Context is basically everything here.
Right, the early 20th century.
Exactly. Modernism, as a literary period, was this violent reaction to a world that felt completely shattered. I mean, think about the aftermath of World War I. You have millions dead, entire empires collapse.
A total devastation.
Yeah, writers are dealing with intense disillusionment, the breakdown of old certainties, and this sweeping spiritual emptiness. And Eliot's poetry doesn't just, describe that modern condition. It basically becomes the defining voice of it.
Which actually brings up a fascinating irony that I noticed in the notes. Because, he is the quintessential voice of post-war European despair. But the man was born in St. Louis, Missouri.
Yeah, it's wild, right?
It really is. The guy writing the most devastating critiques of modern European civilization is literally an American who worked a day job at Lloyd's Bank in London. So, if a multiple choice question asks about his nationality, what does the exam classify him as? An American writer?
Say that transatlantic shift is a classic hurdle for students. The test makers will offer options trying to box him in as strictly American or strictly British. But in 1927, two massive things happened that changed his trajectory.
Okay, what were they?
He officially became a British citizen and he converted to Anglo-Catholicism.
Oh, wow. Both in the same year.
Both in 1927. And because of this dual background, the UGC NET frequently treats Eliot as an Anglo-American writer.
Yeah.
You really have to recognize that dual identity.
Okay, so classifying him by a single nationality is a trap in itself. Got it. So instead of just memorizing a rote list of publication dates, let's organize his life the way a test maker thinks about it. Looking at these notes, it feels like his career is best understood in 3 distinct acts.
I love that.
Yeah.
That is a much more effective way to retain the timeline. Think of Act 1 as the early anxiety phase.
Early anxiety.
Yeah. This is the 1910s, defined by the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock in 1915 and his major critical essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, in 1919. It's all about the neurotic, hesitant, modern man.
Okay, then Act 2 would be what? The post-war wreckage.
Exactly.
This is the 1920s, featuring his absolute behemoth, The Wasteland, in 1922, followed by The Hollow Men in 1925. This is where society has just completely collapsed.
Precisely. And finally, Act 3 is the later conversion. So after he becomes a British citizen and converts in 1927, his work shifts. You get the verse Drama Murder in the Cathedral in 1935 and his later poetic masterpiece, 4 Quartets.
Which was published between 1935 and 1942, right?
Yes. And this final act is really a search for spiritual order. That entire 3-act journey basically culminates in him winning the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948.
Okay, so having that 3-act structure in your head, anxiety, wreckage, conversion, that gives you a solid mental filing cabinet for the exam. But to truly decode his early modernism, we have to look at what he was fighting against. Because he didn't just write new poems, he basically started a rebellion against the Romantics.
Oh, he completely burned the previous rule book. I mean, when we think of 19th century Romantic poetry, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, they think of poetry as this profound personal expression.
Like pouring your heart out on the page.
Exactly. The Romantics believed art was spontaneous, emotional, and centered entirely on the individual self. Wordsworth famously called poetry the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings.
Right. But Eliot looks at a shattered post-WWI world and decides that celebrating the self is entirely the wrong approach. Like, the individual ego just isn't enough to make sense of this chaos.
Yeah, he completely upends the Romantic ideal. In his 1919 essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, Eliot introduced the concept of the impersonality of poetry.
The impersonality.
Right. He argued that art must be highly disciplined, impersonal, and deeply rooted in tradition. There's a quote from that essay that you absolutely need to burn into your memory for the exam. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. He literally demands the surrender of the self.
Wait, so if a test question claims that Eliot viewed poetry as a form of personal confession, you need to immediately flag that as false. He championed impersonality.
Absolutely.
But this brings up a huge conceptual question. If a poet isn't supposed to pour their own raw feelings onto the page, how do they create art? Like, how does the emotion actually get there?
Eliot answers this with a brilliantly scientific analogy. He calls it the catalytic theory. He basically wants to separate the man who suffers from the mind which creates.
Okay, I like that distinction.
Yeah, so to explain this, he asks us to imagine a chemical reaction. Think of a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. If you introduce a piece of platinum into that chamber, the two gases suddenly combine to form sulfurous acid.
Okay, but what happens to the platinum?
Nothing. The platinum remains completely unchanged. It doesn't become part of the acid, it doesn't lose any of its own mass. It merely facilitates the reaction.
Oh, wow. Wait, so instead of the poet pouring their own heart out, they are just the beaker where the reaction happens. The art has emotion, but it's not the poet's raw, unedited diary entry.
That is the perfect way to put it. The poet's mind is the platinum. The poet takes various elements, feelings, historical traditions, observations, and just provides the space for them to react and form a new piece of art. The poet themselves remain separate from the reaction.
That is the essence of impersonality. And I'm guessing it also explains his view on tradition, right? Because test makers will often try to trick you by saying that because Eliot was a modernist who broke rules, he must have rejected literary tradition.
Oh, that is a massive trap. Completely false. He didn't reject tradition, he redefined it.
How so?
Well, he argued that a true poet must possess a historical sense. That means feeling the presence of the past in the modern moment. Tradition isn't just some dead museum exhibit.
Right, it's not just dusty old books.
Exactly. It's a living, active force that the poet's platinum mind uses to create new art.
Okay, so the poet's mind is a catalyst, and the poetry is impersonal. But that leads us to a really practical problem for the writer. If you are a poet and you are forbidden from just saying, I am overwhelmingly sad, how do you actually make the reader feel sadness? How do you engineer that emotion without spelling it out?
This is where we encounter Eliot's most famous and, frankly, most highly tested critical tool, the objective correlative.
The objective correlative.
Yes. This concept was introduced in his 1919 essay, Hamlet and His Problems. Eliot defined it as a set of objects, a situation, or a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion.
So it's basically the ultimate rule of show, don't tell.
Pretty much, yeah.
It makes me think of how a great filmmaker operates. Like, if a director wants to show that a character is grieving the loss of a spouse, they don't have the actor stare into the camera and monologue about their sadness.
Right, that would be terrible.
Exactly. Instead, the camera lingers on an empty chair at a dining table. Or it shows an untouched cup of coffee getting cold. It highlights the deafening tick of a clock in an empty room.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. Those objects and that specific situation act as a mathematical formula. When the audience perceives that sensory data, it evokes the emotion of grief automatically. The objects correlate to the emotion. You don't have to state the feeling because the objects do all the heavy lifting.
But this is where Eliot drops a total bombshell in literary criticism. He uses this exact concept, the objective correlative, to critique William Shakespeare.
He does.
He looks at Hamlet, widely considered one of the greatest plays ever written, and calls it an artistic failure. Hold on. He called Hamlet an artistic failure. That is a wildly spicy take for a literary exam. Why does he go after Hamlet?
Because Eliot argues that the emotion Hamlet, the character, feels is completely out of proportion to the facts presented in the play.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hamlet is consumed by absolute disgust and madness, but the actual situational trigger, his mother's hasty remarriage to his uncle, Eliot, argues that it doesn't structurally justify the massive cosmic scale of Hamlet's emotional reaction.
Ah, I see. So because the facts of the story don't adequately support the size of the emotion, Eliot says the formula is broken, the emotion is in excess of the fact.
Exactly. And that is a crucial point for the UGC NET. If a multiple-choice question asks what Eliot thought of Hamlet, do not fall into the trap of assuming he thought it was a masterpiece just because it's Shakespeare.
Right. Don't let the Shakespeare name blind you.
Yeah. He explicitly labeled it an artistic failure because it lacked a functional objective correlative.
It's just fascinating how clinical his approach to literature is. It's almost like literary engineering. And there's another major critical concept we need to pull from the notes, the dissociation of sensibility. Where does this one come from?
Now, this one is frequently confused with the Hamlet essay, so you really need to be careful here. The dissociation of sensibility comes from his 1921 essay, The Metaphysical Poets.
Okay, the metaphysical poets.
Right. Sensibility essentially means how we perceive and feel the world. Eliot argued that older writers, specifically the 17th century metaphysical poets like John Donne, possessed a unified sensibility.
Meaning they didn't separate their intellect from their emotions?
Yes. They could fuse thought and feeling together seamlessly. Eliot wrote that a poet like Donne could feel a thought as immediately as the odor of a rose.
Wow, that's a great line.
It is. But as literature progressed into the 18th and 19th centuries, poets suffered a dissociation. A split occurred. Poetry became either aggressively intellectual and dry or wildly emotional and sloppy. The intellect and the emotion were divorced.
So Eliot's goal with modernism is to heal that split, to get back to a unified sensibility where complex thought and deep emotion are stitched perfectly back together.
Exactly.
Okay, we've established the theories impersonality, the objective correlative, the unified sensibility. Now, how did Eliot actually build his masterpieces using these tools? Let's give our listener the ultimate multiple-choice cheat sheet for identifying his poems based on their themes and mechanics.
Oh, this is essential. The exam makers love to give you a thematic description or a famous line and ask you to identify the poem. Let's start with his Act 1 era, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock.
Okay, Prufrock.
If an exam question describes a theme of intense indecision, social paralysis, or overwhelming urban anxiety, you are looking at Prufrock.
This is the poem of the hyper-neurotic modern man who is like too terrified to even ask a question at a party, right?
Yes. And the cheat code line to look for here is, I have measured out my life with coffee spoons.
Think about how brilliant that objective correlative is. He doesn't say, my life has been trivial and repetitive. He gives you the image of measuring out an entire human existence in tiny, safe, repetitive scoops of coffee.
It's so depressing, but so good.
It perfectly correlates to the emotion of a wasted, cautious life.
Moving to Act 2. What happens if that individual anxiety infects the entire human race? Like if the exam question mentions empty modern beings, a complete failure of the human will or spiritual death, that points directly to the hollow men, right?
Absolutely. And the defining line to associate with the hollow men is legendary. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper.
Oof. Not with a bang, but a whimper.
It is the ultimate expression of a society that doesn't even have the energy to destroy itself violently. It just fades away into pathetic apathy. Which brings us to the behemoth of the exam, the heavyweight champion of modernist poetry, The Wasteland, from 1922. This is the ultimate landscape of cultural decay and spiritual barrenness in post-WWI Europe. Let's really unpack this one because it is a goldmine for test questions.
First, you have to know the dedication. Eliot dedicated The Wasteland to his friend and fellow poet Ezra Pound. He called Pound Il Miglior Fabbro, which translates to the better craftsman.
Why did he call him that?
Because Pound ruthlessly edited the original manuscript. He cut it down significantly and shaped the final fragmented masterpiece we know today.
That's a great detail. Another massive non-negotiable test tip, you must know the structure. Examiners love to ask how many sections The Wasteland has, often offering 4 or 6 as trick options. It has exactly 5 sections.
Yeah.
The Burial of the Dead, a game of chess, the Fire Sermon, Death by Water, and What the Thunder Said.
And the poem famously opens with the line, April is the cruelest month, which subverts the traditional idea of spring being a joyful time of rebirth, because in A Wasteland, rebirth is painful. But the most important structural element the UGC NET tests is how Eliot organized this poem. He used something called the mythic method.
And this isn't just a fancy academic term. The mechanics of the mythic method are actually incredible. Instead of writing a straightforward narrative, Eliot took modern, chaotic, often vulgar scenes of urban life, like a meaningless sexual encounter in a dirty London flat, and layered them directly on top of ancient, sacred myths.
Yeah, he pulled heavily from the Grail legend, James Fraser's anthropological study, The Golden Bough, and classical antiquity.
By taking a sacred, ancient story and forcing it to exist right next to a spiritually dead, modern reality, he creates intense friction in the reader's mind. The contrast does the emotional work.
Exactly. He doesn't have to explain that modern society has lost its soul. The jarring juxtaposition of a majestic ancient myth crashing into an empty modern pub makes you feel that loss instantly. It is the objective correlative applied to an entire civilization.
It's brilliant. And he doesn't just use Western myth, right? The Eastern philosophical influence is vital for the exam, too. The poem ends with a search for spiritual discipline amidst the ruins.
Yeah, this is a highly specific trap. The poem concludes with words from the Upanishads Dada, Dayadvam, Damyata, meaning give, sympathize, control. This is followed by the chant, Shanti, 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 which Eliot translated as the peace which passeth understanding.
Okay, so what's the trap there?
Well, some students confuse this as coming exclusively from Buddhist scripture. While Eliot did study Buddhism in the context of this specific poem and the UGC NET exam, those closing words are heavily linked to the Hindu Upanishads.
Okay, good to know. Just to round out the major works, if a multiple-choice question pivots away from poetry and mentions the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, you immediately pair that with his verse drama, Murder in the Cathedral.
That's his Act 3 era, the shift into religious and historical themes following his conversion.
So, if our listener is staring down a tricky question, the clock is ticking, and they are trying to eliminate wrong answers, what is the core Eliot vibe they should look for? How do we distill all of this into a single skeleton key?
The study notes offer a fantastic memory formula for precisely this moment. If you are stuck, apply this equation, Eliot equals modern crisis, plus fragmented poetry, plus a redefined tradition, plus impersonality, plus the objective correlative, plus a spiritual search.
I love that.
If an answer choice aligns with that formula, it is highly likely to be correct. If an answer choice contradicts it, by suggesting poetry is a spontaneous emotional confession, you can immediately eliminate it.
That formula is incredibly powerful. Now, throughout this deep dive, we've naturally uncovered a lot of the traps examiners use, but I want to make sure we've thoroughly disarmed the minefield. The test makers are crafty, and they rely on students' confusing essay titles and biographical details. So let's synthesize the 10 biggest pitfalls so you are completely immune to them. I'll lob the traps at you, and you knock them down.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Trap 1. T.S. Eliot was born in England.
False. Born in America, St. Louis, Missouri.
Trap 2. He remained strictly an American writer his whole life.
Wrong again. He became a British citizen in 1927. He is an Anglo-American writer.
Trap 3. The concept of the objective correlative comes from tradition and the individual talent.
A classic misdirection. Tradition and the individual talent is about impersonality. The objective correlative is entirely tied to his critiquing Hamlet and his problems.
Nice. Trap 4. Dissociation of sensibility is from the Hamlet essay.
Nope. They're testing your precision there. Dissociation of sensibility is from metaphysical poets. You have to keep those 3 major essays strictly separated.
Okay, trap 5. The waist gland has 4 sections.
Wrong. It has exactly 5 sections.
Trap 6. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti is from Buddhist scripture only.
False. In the UGC NET context, it's linked to the Upanishadic ending.
Trap 7. Eliot believed poetry is a personal confession.
Definitely not. He argues for the impersonality of poetry, the surrender of the self.
Trap 8. Eliot thought Shakespeare's Hamlet was a complete success.
Wrong. He explicitly called it an artistic failure because it lacked an objective correlative.
Trap 9. Because he was a modernist, Eliot rejected tradition.
False. He redefined it. He argued for the historical sense.
And finally, trap 10. Eliot is only tested as a poet.
Wrong. He's a pioneering critic and a dramatist, too. You have to know his essays and his plays.
Boom! Minefield cleared. We set out to hack the UGC NET English exam's biggest boss, and look how far we've come. We've tracked his timeline from his Missouri origins to his Nobel Prize, categorizing his life into anxiety, wreckage, and conversion.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We explored the platinum catalyst that allows for impersonal art. We broke down how a filmmaker's empty chair explains the objective correlative. We survived his clinical dismantling of Shakespeare. And we've armed you with the exact formulas needed to identify the mythic, fragmented decay of the wasteland.
You absolutely have the tools now. You know the mechanics of his poetry, the underlying logic of his criticism, and the specific ways test makers will try to use his complexity against you. You are ready for the exam. But, exploring Eliot raises a profound question that goes far beyond just passing a test.
Oh, really? What stands out to you from the broader perspective?
Well, we spent a lot of time today dissecting Eliot's early despair, the wasteland of the modern world, the paralyzing anxiety of Prufrock, the spiritual death of the hollow man. But remember his final act, Four Quartets.
Right, his Act 3.
Written after his conversion, it focuses heavily on time, eternity, and spiritual reconciliation. And the most famous line from that collection is, "In my beginning is my end."
Wow, it's a massive shift from absolute hopelessness to a search for divine historical order.
Exactly. Eliot looked at his post-war world, a world of shattered institutions, fragmented voices, and spiritual emptiness, and he called it a wasteland. But he didn't stop there. He used the historical sense to try and rebuild. And really want to leave you, the listener, with this thought to mull over.
Lay it on us.
Think about our world today. We live in an age of hyperfragmentation, digital alienation, and massive information overload. In many ways, are we still stuck in Eliot's wasteland? Or, using his blueprint, can we actively use our own history and traditions to find a unified sensibility again? Like, can we get to a place where our intellect and our emotions are finally stitched back together?
Man, that is the real test, isn't it? Figuring out how to navigate the modern world without just whimpering in the dark. It turns out, to beat the final boss, you don't just memorize his cheat codes, you have to truly understand the game he was playing. Thanks for joining us for